I've played a variety of games over the years, ranging from something as casual as an idle game to something as hardcore as an arcade-like game, but I'd never really played through a Soulsborne game before. This all changed forever as a certain friend of mine gifted me with a very particular game. In case you can't tell by the title of this video, that game is of course Dark Souls 3. There's no doubt that it's Soulsborne and thus pretty challenging, but is it good? That's exactly what I hope to tackle in this review and question. First off, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. This game tore me a new one about 1,000 times over. Many Soulsborne veterans insist that Dark Souls 3 is actually easy compared to others, but you're talking to a complete scrub here. From my perspective, Dark Souls 3 was quite a brutal challenge indeed, but the important thing is it never feels unfair. To start out with, stamina is basically everything in this game. Running, attacking, defending, avoiding, pretty much anything substantial in this game other than walking around is on this little green meter. While games like Zelda Breath of the Wild used a stamina bar for some things, this game absolutely relies on it, so managing it is absolutely vital. That means you really cannot afford to be too greedy, as I found myself doing quite often. If you attack until your stamina is gone, you're almost certainly going to be in for a world of hurt. Luckily, you can increase your stamina bar with the endurance stat, which brings us to the part that makes this technically a JRPG. Much like previous Dark Souls games, you gain souls from defeating enemies, with bosses of course giving you substantially more of them than weaker enemies. Rather than being purely for EXP, souls are your entire currency in the game as well, so if you want to level up or buy things of any kind, you gotta have some soul, brother. In a way, this simplifies things and makes things more complicated as a result. Your potential stats are strength, dexterity, endurance, vitality, vigor, attunement, intelligence, faith, and luck. Let's break it down. Strength tends to be tied to big, beefy weapons, the kind that are slow going but are likely to knock your opponent down. Dexterity is the exact opposite and tends to be associated with speedier weapons. Attunement determines your focus points, basically mana in this game, in addition to attunement slots for spells and miracles. Vigor determines how much health you have, and I learned the hard way how painful things can get if you neglect it, so make sure you give it some love too. Endurance, as I mentioned, raises the stamina bar, making it another vital choice. Vitality increases your weight limit, which is important if you want heftier armor and weapons, as 70% of your weight capacity and higher causes your roll to become slow and awkward, called fat rolling. God help you if it gets above 100%, where you can't even roll at all or run, just slowly walk. So depending on what kind of armor and weapons you plan on equipping, that one's also slightly important. Intelligence is mainly for spells, and faith is mainly for miracles. Those two, as well as dexterity and strength, also have weapons that have varying required numbers of them, and having less will get the attack power of the weapon in question. With spells and miracles, though, it's a hard requirement to actually use them, although you can supplement it with certain rings. Luck is mainly item discovery, the odds enemies will drop certain things. Being hollow and having a hollow infused weapon actually increases your luck and scales off of it, but I still wouldn't put a heavy focus on it unless you're going for something like bleed or poison. Speaking of infusing, you can reinforce and infuse weapons with Andre, the local blacksmith from Dark Souls 1. Reinforcing is done with Titanite shards, Twinkling Titanite, and Titanite scales. The latter two are actually far more rare and only purchasable pretty late in the game, before which they're limited pickups. They tend to be special weapons, so only up to +4 in level, while normal weapons can go up to +9. You can get them up to +5 or +10 respectively, but you need a Titanite slab, which are hard limited in quantity, so definitely don't waste those. To infuse, you also need to bring Andre certain coals to unlock it, like poison and the like with Farron coal. It's essentially there to make sure you can't do it too soon. You can then use gems to infuse weapons with certain things, like to increase scaling with strength and dexterity, or to infuse them with something like fire or magic damage. Be warned though that it will have detrimental effects like a lower base damage, and it seems to always decrease stability, leading to more stamina usage per swing. You can use shriving stones, thankfully, to restore a weapon at base, but you should probably be careful not to waste gems, at least not early on. And on the subject of weapon scaling, not only do strength, dexterity, intelligence, and faith have requirements, but they also have scaling. It ranges from E to A and then S, the higher one having more of an impact. Typically, having more faith and intelligence will increase elemental damage, while dexterity and strength will increase physical damage. Many weapons use both strength and dexterity, making a quality build very viable. For those of you not in the know, quality basically means having strength and dexterity as the focus. Obviously, this isn't the only kind of combination of requirements weapons can have, so make sure you look into that. Then there's status effects, both to be added to your weapon or naturally on it, as well as being afflicted to you. Bleed builds up and damages if the meter fills up. Frostbite does likewise, but also reduces stamina regeneration and damage absorption temporarily. Poison and toxic drain health when full until the meter is fully depleted, with toxic draining faster. You can even be stricken with leeches with bleed. Luckily, a leech-based bleed can be cured pretty easily with a torch handy. The one you really need to watch out for, of course, and one you sadly can't make use of yourself, is Curse. A Curse meter fills up, and if it hits the top, you're dead. Perhaps due to its devastating potential, Frostbite is also arguably the most underused among the ones you can actually use. In the base game, you have no way of buffing or infusing with Frostbite, it has to come with it. Ashes of Ariandel does mitigate this a little bit with a spell to buff weapons with Frost, but still no resin or infusion. I think I've droned on enough about leveling and weapons and the like. I could be here all day, so instead let's get right into the combat. You have a left and right hand for either one-handing or two-handing equipment. Typically it'll be a weapon and shield or two-handing a larger weapon. While blocking with a shield is viable, it can be very draining on stamina, and if your stamina depletes while you're guarding, your guard broken, it can be riposted for extra damage, so be careful. Learning when to roll is very important, as rolling actually has frames where you're completely invincible. This means that contrary to your instinct to roll away from danger, you're often encouraged to roll directly into an attack to exploit the iframes and punish the enemy afterwards. If you get damaged, you've got a limited amount of Estus Flask uses to guzzle to get your health back up. Along the way, you can find shards to bring to Entree to increase the uses and undead bone shards to burn in bonfires to increase the potency of each use. Bonfires, of course, are your safe zones. They restore your health and Estus Flask and allow you to fast travel to any other discovered bonfire. Be wary though, as using a bonfire also respawns normal enemies, although one thing you can do with new bonfires is just light them and not sit down on them, as that still unlocks them as a fast travel point. Shifting back to combat, you have 4 ways of attacking. You have right and left hand, of course, but then you have a light and strong version of each. Typically your left hand strong attack is some kind of weapon art. Typically it's either a shield's weapon art, such as parrying an attack to stun your enemy and punishing them, or a two-handed weapons art. Some shields actually copy the weapon art of your right hand, allowing you to use a shield and sword while still reaping some benefits of a two-handed weapon. This gives you a lot of possibilities, which especially comes in handy for larger weapons. Just be aware that most types of weapon arts drain focus points. While poise does exist in this game, it's basically useless as a passive effect. You could have all the poise in the world and the weakest enemies will stagger you easily. Going into that, poise mainly affects hyper armor in this game. Hyper armor is basically frames and attacks, especially beefier weapons that make you immune to stagger so that you can trade damage and not get stunned out of your attack so easily. The more poise you have, the more hyper armor you have in those attacks. This can also tie into weapon arts, because some weapon arts for beefier weapons specifically give you a temporary poise buff that essentially makes you immune to stagger, typically to follow up with a strong attack. Obviously you need to manage your FP while you're doing that. I actually forgot to mention earlier that you can restore FP not only through a bonfire, but through a special blue Estus. You can assign it through Entree, and you get up to 15 uses to split between it and the health restoring one. You also have limited use items, such as ones to cure status effects or bundles, or resin to temporarily buff your weapons with some kind of element to capitalize on enemy weakness. Special weapons though, typically ones that require scales or twinkling, cannot be buffed, nor can they be infused with Entree. One such special weapon is boss weapons, which you can get by transposing boss souls. You just need a special type of item from an optional boss and give it to Ludleth. You can also transpose other things like spells and rings. Probably the single biggest anomaly in this game for buffing is the Lothric Knight Greatsword, since it has split lightning damage but can still be infused and buffed. You can find those in Lothric Castle, which unless you're willing to sequence break with a certain tough enemy, is going to be pretty late into the base game. As mentioned before, you can also equip up to 4 rings to buff yourself with. Ones like Havel's Ring to increase your weight capacity are an absolute must-have. The Ring City DLC actually has several +3 variants, which are normally only found in New Game Plus, which is also a thing. Enemies get tougher with each New Game Plus up to +7. Another thing to consider is that you can ember yourself. It essentially fulfills the same thing as humanity in the original Dark Souls, and that if you die, you lose the ember and your maximum health isn't as high. You get embered by defeating bosses or popping an ember, which is typically dropped by knight-like enemies like Lothric Knights. When you're embered, you're also vulnerable to being invaded, either by NPCs in select areas or other players if you're playing online. However, you can also summon players and sometimes NPCs in the form of white signatures on the ground. If they're from a covenant though, it may appear in another color such as golden, and you should be wary of the purple ones because they can also attack you. This can come in handy if there's one boss you're having a difficult time with, or if you just want to co-op with a buddy or something. I'm ashamed to admit I summoned for a number of bosses, although only 3 with an actual player. With several, I actually used in-game NPCs, which are available for some bosses in certain circumstances. In addition to being invaded randomly by players that have red eye orbs, you can choose to accept a red sub sign to invite an invader, which many see as dueling, although the DLCs both have a way to get a proper arena via Champion's Bones. Some Covenants also invade automatically when you enter certain areas, such as Farron Keep or Anorlando. You can also use Dried Fingers to get more White Phantoms, but that also leaves you more vulnerable to additional invasions. And this isn't even getting into the bosses that often have very strong attacks and combos to keep you on your toes even further. Basically, Dark Souls 3 is the complexity of a JRPG with almost the twitchiness of a fighting game. Nothing ever feels truly unfair, although the camera can certainly work against you sometimes, but it's certainly a lot to keep track of, and it can easily overwhelm you if you're not careful. As much frustration and misery as it caused me, I kept coming back for more. It's extremely punishing, but that's the funny thing about games, because the bigger the frustration, the more satisfying the payoff. Dark Souls 3 definitely delivers on that front, and there are more easier options if you actually need them. Journo's saying it needs an easy mode or ignorant, because if you want an easy mode, then look around for better gear, level up as much as possible, and summon a friend or two. It really is that simple. How hard the game is up to you entirely, and you can even go without gear and never level up, you crazy little fiend you. In short, the gameplay is extremely deep, quite hard if you don't take a ton of shortcuts, and also... Naturally, Dark Souls 3 takes place after the first 2. The Lords of Cinder who link the fire are resurrected and refuse to return to their thrones. This, of course, means that the fire is dying out and you are resurrected as an unkindled Ashen One to return them to their thrones, even if by force. The 3 brought up immediately in the opening are Aldrich, Yorm, and the Abyss Watchers. Oh no, you heard correct, Watchers. As in, there are several members who link their souls to serve as one Lord of Cinder. Now, I won't spoil anything major, but the plot is a lot more intricate than you may think if you aren't familiar with Soulsborne games. Most of the plot is actually contained in the item description, so it can be easy to miss out on if you aren't paying attention. I actually kind of enjoy this log plot approach, as I'm sure I mentioned before, as that means the game doesn't beat you over the head too much and you're free to absorb as much as you actually want to. After taking down the 3 initial Lords of Cinder, there's actually a 4th one you then have to take down. After you do that, you're taken to the first kiln where you must fight what's effectively the Guardian of the Fire. Even just giving his name would be a spoiler, so I'll just say you may find it particularly shocking if you played the first one. I haven't, but I still found it to be a very interesting little development. Essentially, you can choose to link the fire at the end, let the fire die, or usurp the fire for yourself. Whichever path you choose is up to you entirely, but of course I linked the fire. Then there's the 2 DLCs, the Ashes of Ariandel and the Ring City. The Ashes of Ariandel are accessible early enough in the game on the way into the cathedral, but the Ring City actually requires you to beat the Ashes of Ariandel or make it to the first kiln. Naturally, they both have more challenges than the main game and have their own little stories about them. The Ashes of Ariandel begin with an old man named Gale who asks for your help in burning down the painted world and showing his lady, whoever that is, flame. You'll have to make your way through a snowy world, locating the lady in question and introducing flame to the world, overcoming the 2 who desperately want to stop you. All I'm gonna say is when you see the final boss, there's gonna be a nasty little surprise waiting for you. The painted world seems to be directly tied to Priscilla's world from the first Dark Souls in many significant ways, but that would be going into spoiler territory, of course. The Ring City starts out with a dreg heap. Your first encounter with another living being is a stone-humped old hag. You eventually make your way into the Ring City itself and perform certain actions that I'm obviously not going to spoil, but it sort of makes you wonder if you weren't heavily in the wrong for doing them. It's also in the Ring City where Gale gets closure, and another returning character from the main franchise shows himself if you follow a certain quest line. On the face of it, Dark Souls 3 has a lot of messed up things happening under the surface, such as villagers being selected as sacrifices to a bloated cannibalistic lord, and maidens turned insane being prison guards wielding branding irons that they presumably used to torture inmates with. Despite that, though, the world isn't 100% doom and gloom. There's just enough hope and rays of light beneath the surface that it doesn't feel like morbid for the sake of being morbid, if that makes any sense. I actually call it almost like Zelda for adults because of how overall similar the gameplay feels and the plot being so intricate. Most of the NPCs are at least decent people trying to get by, and even the resident jerk has some redeemable qualities to him. Depending on your actions, you can at least try to get better outcomes from any of the NPCs, even if they're largely bittersweet, like giving one what she's always dreamed of, but her companion ends up dying or something of that nature. Of course, Dark Souls doesn't stop you from making mistakes with quests and even flat out killing the NPCs if you actually want to and can handle them when they fight back. Andre, the handmaid, and the firekeeper in the shrine, as well as the lady in the painting, all resurrect if killed due to mechanical or plot importance, but pretty much everyone else will be permanently dead if you kill them. Not only does the game have a ton of optional content with quests and the like, but if you're going for the most basic ending, 4 of the areas in the base game are completely optional, with 2 of them being optional regardless of what ending you go for. This, along with a treasure trove of lore that you can read up on, or even just talk to NPCs to get a bit more out of them, Dark Souls 3 is a deceptively deep game when you look more into it. Despite the game's brutal difficulty, once the plot started clicking for me, I really didn't want to stop. The Abyss Watchers hailing from the Abyss Walkers, what remains of Orlando, Sigmaier's descendant, all of it kept me yearning to come back for more abuse. If for no other reason, do it for her. Dark Souls 3 is a PS4-era game having released after Bloodborne. You can certainly tell because it takes advantage of the extra horsepower of systems available at the time. Contrary to previous Dark Souls games, the detail's been really ramped up. While LODs are quite aggressive, that seems to be because there's little nooks and crannies and decorative pieces absolutely everywhere. Whether it's individual stone tiles jutting out of the ground or a certain boss arena that's littered with corpses, there's no one for environmental intricacy. One thing that's also a really nice touch is just how much of the game's world is interwoven into the background, something I've heard was very much a thing in Dark Souls but is very prominent here. When you get past the second boss and gaze down the high wall of Lothric, you can see the majority of locations in the game, or at least the base game. And Orlando itself makes a grand appearance as a location, and it's received a huge graphical bump over the first one. Not just copy and paste either, it's been touched up and the roofs certainly are mercifully wider and some areas are even torn apart. One of the characters from that location also returns, albeit in a tragic way, and you can tell it's not the same 3D model because he looks much older. While most of the game can look very drab, it does have some nice change of scenery every now and then. Irithil of the Boreal Valley and the Painted World of Ariandel if you have the DLC, or Winter Wonderlands to contrast pretty nicely with everything else. You also have a variety of environments, such as a castle wall, a village, more cathedrals and churches that you can swing a Moonlight Greatsword at, and other things like catacombs and dungeons. You can even break into an area called the Smoldering Lake, a very hell-like place covered in chaos demons. The animations are also quite smooth and well done. It becomes pretty obvious that Dark Souls 3 was inspired by Bloodborne, as the previous 2 games almost feel like they're going in slow motion compared to the third one. Everything's snappy, and regardless of what weapon you're swinging, it feels true to the physics involved. There are a couple of weapons that are surprisingly fast for their size, and the way the momentum carries them actually seem believable, albeit improbable for someone in the real world to pull that off. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the gorgeous music on display. While the game mostly lacks music in favor of a mostly quiet world with the fighting to liven things up, certain moments like boss fights come with their own aggressive little soundtracks. These can range from the eerily calm music of one boss to the heart-pounding riffs of another. Typically though, boss music tends to follow one mood of depressing, which seems to be very much the theme of this world. Most of the bosses also have second phase music that they will transition into that tend to be more intense than the one before it. The voice acting was excellently done for the most part. From Sigvard's charmingly bumbling hero's voice to the heart-melting voices of characters like the Firekeeper and Arena of Karim, and even some downright intimidating voices like Egon and Sir Wilhelm. The game isn't afraid to mess with your expectations either, like depicting one character as very sweet and innocent and another as ghoulish, and completely flipping which one you assume is manipulating the other. A few of the boss fights are even voice acted, and they mostly end up being the most tragic ones. I'm not one to really go into depth about sound effects, but they sound just fine in Dark Souls 3. The beefy sound when you light or rest at a bonfire are incredibly satisfying, and each weapon sounds appropriate. Naturally, the largest weapons that I took to using sound really beefy when you use them, especially weapons arts abilities. The enemies of course have their own sounds to make, and some select few have the ability to talk. 2 cases I can think of actually end up making the enemies creepy rather than tragic like the bosses. I shall partake in the creepiness factor. Basically, Dark Souls 3 is a very beautiful and intricate game from top to bottom. The lore kept me going more than anything, but the music and aesthetics certainly didn't hurt either. While it's certainly a very drab-looking game the majority of the time due to the decrepit state of the world, that doesn't mean it can't look very pleasing to the eye. From Software clearly put a lot of love and effort into that part of it. I always sort of found the relationship option of complicated to be a little silly, but that's the best way I can describe this game, to be honest. When I'm being frustrated by a boss or otherwise painful endeavor, it can be so easy to think I despise the game and want nothing to do with it. However, nothing could be further from the truth. When I got so furious and even downright going into a meltdown of the game's challenges, I still wanted to press forward just to see what would happen next. Some of that is challenge completion obsession that I think to some extent all gamers have, but it's also because the plot and the world building are just that good. It would have been so easy for From Software to rest on their laurels. They could have settled for playing into infamy and just making a super hard game that's simplistic in nature. That's pretty much the crux behind games like I Want to Be the Guy, not saying there's anything wrong with them, of course. However, they weren't satisfied with ending it on something like that. You can tell they truly loved the series and the world they were crafting. Even though I've only really played the third entry of the Dark Souls franchise, I still feel kind of saddened by its departure. I hope the Elden Ring can take up the mantle, and I hope Bloodborne gets ported to the PC one day. Until then, if this must be my one and only Soulsborne game at the moment, at least it was certainly a very good one. I can't recommend this game enough. It's worth the struggles and the pain, and you can always engage in some jolly cooperation if you find yourself stuck. This has been my review of Dark Souls 3. Thank you so much for watching. Just pick up your weapon and or shield, of course, start chugging Estus like a madman, and long may the sun shine. Well, I'm going to have myself a little nap. The only thing to do, really, after a nice review.